All right, everybody. Cinephile Mike is here, and it is episode 12 of Oscar Rewind Season 2, my bi weekly series dropping every Tuesday and Friday, where I revisit films that reflect the work of this past year's Oscar nominees and winners. I dig deep into those IMDb profiles, and my hope is that you will discover a new, older favorite, or maybe discover something that you haven't watched in a while. As always, I'll be discussing the Oscar connection, awards history for the film, box office information, critical response, and as always, these reviews are spoiler free. Before we dive in, do me a favor, please click that subscribe button. You definitely don't want to miss any of the cinematic goodness we're going to be talking about this season. And we're going to keep moving it right along as we've been doing this month. And soon we're going to be wrapping up as we get to the end of April. We're looking at the earlier work of those producers, and in some cases, directors and writers, and multiple people like today's, who were nominated for the 10 Best Picture nominees this year. I haven't hit every single producer, but I've gotten to most. And we are going to wrap up our brutal week. I'm looking today at IFC Films' The Childhood of a Leader. Based on the novella of the same name by Jean-Paul Sartre, the film was co-written by the film's director, Brady Corbet, and his frequent collaborator and wife, Mona Fastvold. And our brutalist connections don't end there. I'll get there in a moment. The Childhood of a Leader had some screenings in the summer of 2016, but not enough to track at the box office, at least not domestically. However, there was a brief release in the UK and a few other international markets, so the film does report an international and thereby worldwide box office take of $245,546. Critically, the film was divided with a current 90% critical rating coming from 67 reviews, but the much lower popcorn meter score of 54% coming from over 1,000 audience reviews. So, did Childhood of a Leader have an awards journey? Yes, it did. Amongst its half dozen wins and separate dozen nominations, some of the highlights were from the Independent Spirit Awards, where the film was nominated for Best First Feature, nominee for Corbet, Fastfold, and the rest of their six-person strong production team, as well as a Best Cinematography nod for Lowell Crowley, who was also nominated for this film by the American Society of Cinematographers. The film was also successful at the Venice Film Festival, where Corbet was nominated for Best Film, but also won three prizes. He won Best Debut Film, Best Director, and a Special Mention Prize. So, why is this film here? Well, if you've been following me every day, you know that this is Brutalist Week, and I gave my brutal clue. You're probably tired of that pun. I'm sorry. We're done after today. If not, if this is the first time you're popping up, you probably heard, hey, Brady Corbet, didn't he do The Brutalist? Yes, he did. Three Oscar nominations for him this year for writing, directing, and producing The Brutalist, which were three of the 10 nominations the film got. Also connected between Childhood of a Leader and The Brutalist, Mona Fastvold, his frequent collaborator, shared the Best Picture and Best Original Screenplay nods with Corbet. And also, one of the producers of The Brutalist, Brian Young, has an executive producer credit on Childhood of a Leader. So we have three of the Brutalist producers referenced here. Also, if you are a real punit, there are two other names that are connected. One would be Lowell Crowley, who won his first Oscar this year for Best Cinematography for The Brutalist. He worked on Childhood of a Leader, as well as film editor David Jankso, who was nominated for Best Editing for The Brutalist. He also edited Childhood of a Leader. So, let's get into this horrific film. In fact, this is probably one of the most horrific, if not horror films, more psychological thriller films I've talked about in a while, that looks at the rise of a future unnamed fascist leader, in this form, a young blonde haired Prescott played by Tom Sweet. In France, in the year 1919, following the end of World War I, we meet Prescott, American born, and his parents. Father, played by Liam Cunningham, who works as a diplomat on behalf of President Wilson and is in France to help negotiate the Treaty of Versailles, and his mother, played by Bernice Bejo, who is German born and primarily raises their son at home with the help of various individuals, including Ada, played by Stacey Martin, a tutor who has been hired to teach Prescott the French language while they're there, and their maid Mona, played by Yolande Moreau, who, while new to serving this family, has served that house that they're staying in for many years. And we see that Mother, as a disciplinarian, takes some interesting approaches when circumstances call for it. Now, as known by the titles of the three parts of this story, each being named the first, second, and third tantrum, Prescott is not necessarily the most pleasant young man, but you have to wonder, it's that whole argument of nature versus nurture based on the way he's raised and the things he sees and the way he acts. From the jump, we kind of see that he feels like an outsider being American born in this European country, not necessarily knowing the language, the way, people treat him. So sometimes he acts out. Early in the film, we see him after a church pageant rehearsal throwing rocks at adults and other children. He gets frustrated because sometimes people mistake him for a young girl, given that he has the soft facial features and the like almost shoulder length blonde hair. And as we see him kind of growing and becoming who he will be, and the interactions with Ada and Mona and a family friend of the family, Charles Marker, played by Robert Pattinson, each part of the story is, played out in these small vignettes in each of these three tantrums as we kind of see the character growth. This film is an interesting watch. This was Courbet's first film, and it's a powerful narrative film and interesting for a first time feature film director because at the age he was, which probably in his late 20s or so, or 30s, this was not typical the kind of film that you would get from a younger filmmaker, but given his acting resume, which had included working with some of the greats, it's kind of easy to see how he moved into this direction. The film, opens with newsreel footage of, the closing of World War One and different leaders and different things that we've all seen in newsreels, probably learned in school. Now, while we're not going to say that Prescott in this film becomes Hitler or Mussolini in their respective World War II roles, we kind of get an amalgamation of multiple things. We know this is, loosely based on Sartre's novella. His source material is a little bit darker. The lead character named Prescott's actually named Lucien, who becomes specifically an anti-Semitic murderer. Huh. So Corbet goes a slightly different direction and really hangs a lot of this on the shoulders of Tom Sweet, this young actor who really carries this film very well. He's exceptional because this is not an easy film to carry, and playing in the two roles of his parents. We don't see father as much. He's more absentee because he's always traveling for work. So we see a lot more of the time that he spends with mother, Bejo. And, I have to say, this was one of the first things I've seen of hers in a while. And, I, like many of you, fell in love with her, in her big smile, silent era actress in the Oscar winning The Artist. So, this is that actor's dream to really play range where she plays a character that is completely different from what we knew of her in The Artist. And she goes on a really dark journey as well. And even if, Corbet kind of wraps things a little bit with her ending too much, he makes some interesting choices. And, we see how different layers of hypocrisy kind of come into play with this. Pattinson was probably one of the bigger names in the film at the time, but he actually is a smaller supporting role. However, he does make the impact with the choices where Corbet goes and uses him. So it's a really good watch for the acting in this, and that doesn't take away from the technical merits of the film. I'll talk Crowley first. His cinematography, he really works within the frame of this old house that they're in, so much so that the house almost becomes like another character because of the way that they're interacting with the space. So that says a lot about the production design team of Jean-Vincent Puzos, Nora Takacs, and Pani Luder. And something Scott Walker, the composer, has this real haunting, throbbing at moments score that creates such tension, like more so than some of the greatest horror film soundtracks we've heard, where you just, as we see the things that are happening and we have this throbbing, like The way this film ends is quite exceptional, which, while some people may find the film's ending is a little jarring and unsatisfying, I actually love the thought provokingness of it. Think that's a word. Kind of going off script here because I'm going in a different tangent. I was talking about this film briefly with a friend of mine who said he really enjoyed The Brutalist, and he kind of said the childhood of the leader is the beginning, and The Brutalist shows the journey that these filmmakers have made. I kind of differ from him in view with that because I actually found this to be a more solid work than The Brutalist, maybe because there's a little more confinement within the 2 hours versus the 3 hour time frame. Not sure. But unlike The Brutalist, this actually makes me interested to look more into Corbet's work and see where he goes next. For me, the childhood of a leader is disturbing to watch, and I don't know if I'll necessarily watch it again, but it is a very strong 4-star film, much better from the one I discussed earlier this week when I discussed Girl House. Nick Gordon, it's good that you have hitched your wagon to a different producing team. Stay there. If you would like to watch The Childhood of a Leader, it is currently streaming exclusively on AMC Plus, not the app for the theater chain, but the one that is named for the channel. So there you have it. Only a few more episodes of Rewind dedicated to the Best Picture nominees. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Oscar Rewind. If you did, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, share the video, spread the word. You can follow me, Cinephile Mike, on all social media platforms and on Letterboxd, and find lots of great cinematic goodness on my website, cinephilemike.com. All right, everyone. Until next time, this is Cinephile Mike saying take a break and watch something new.